The flight was cruising smoothly at 20,000 feet, the sky calm and painted with soft layers of golden light filtering through thin clouds. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, some chatting quietly, others watching movies or sleeping peacefully. The hum of the engines created a soothing rhythm that blended with the soft chime of seatbelt signs turning off. Everything felt routine, predictable, safe. Even Captain Harris and First Officer Lane exchanged relaxed smiles as they monitored the flight path. It was supposed to be an easy journey, clear weather, no turbulence expected, and a well-maintained aircraft that had passed all pre-flight checks. Nothing hinted at the chaos that was about to erupt. Then, without warning, the first alarm blared inside the cockpit. A piercing, urgent tone that shattered the calm like a blade slicing through silence. Red warning lights erupted across the dashboard, blinking rapidly, demanding immediate attention. Both pilots jerked forward instinctively, eyes widening as they scanned the screens. The left engine indicator flashed with a bright red failure warning. In the same instant, the entire aircraft jolted violently to the side, as if struck by an invisible force. The passengers gasped, some grabbing their armrests, others looking around in confusion. The cockpit shook harder with every passing second. Captain Harris reached for the controls, gripping them tightly as he tried to steady the plane. The jet rolled left sharply, and Lane quickly countered with a series of adjustments, but the aircraft felt unresponsive, sluggish, as though fighting against their every command. The vibrations intensified, rattling the cockpit windows. Harris stole a quick glance outside and saw a trail of dark smoke streaming behind them from the left engine. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a minor fault. It was a catastrophic failure. In the cabin, the once peaceful atmosphere collapsed into hysteria. Oxygen masks bounced against the ceiling panels as the plane trembled violently. Children cried, adults shouted prayers, and flight attendants struggled to keep their balance as they hurried to reassure the terrified passengers. Luggage shifted in the overhead compartments, some tumbling out when the plane shook again. A woman in the back clutched her husband's hand tightly, tears rolling down her face as she whispered, "What's happening?" But even he didn't have an answer. Inside the cockpit, Lane's voice trembled slightly as he read the system diagnostics. Left engine flameout, total loss of thrust, temperature spike, possible compressor stall, we're losing power fast. Harris clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice steady. Shut it down and try the restart sequence. Lane nodded and began working through the emergency procedures, fingers moving rapidly over switches and controls, but the engine refused to respond. Each failed attempt added another layer of dread to the air. The aircraft began to lose altitude slowly at first, then more rapidly. A downward lurch sent another wave of screams through the cabin. Harris pulled back on the yoke, fighting the sinking nose of the plane. The right engine strained loudly, whirring at maximum output in an attempt to compensate, but the aircraft was heavy and unbalanced. With one engine gone at 20,000 feet, they had seconds to prevent a spiraling descent. Lane radioed air traffic control, but the screen filled with static. Only fragments of the message went through, the rest swallowed by interference. Mayday, Mayday, then nothing clear enough for anyone on the ground to understand the severity of the situation. Lane tried again and again, but the interference persisted. It was as though something was blocking their signal, adding yet another complication to their growing list of problems. Captain Harris continued fighting to keep the wings level, but each heartbeat brought a new challenge. The controls felt heavier, the aircraft more resistant. The failing left side dragged like a dead weight. He glanced at Lane, who returned a look filled with fear but determination. They had trained for emergencies, spent countless hours in simulators, but nothing truly prepared pilots for the real intensity of an in-air engine failure with nearly 200 lives depending on them. In the cabin, passengers were tossed against their seat belts as the plane dipped again. Flight attendants shouted instructions, telling people to remain seated and keep masks on, though many struggled to follow anything amid the rising panic. A baby wailed uncontrollably. A man tried to stand, only to fall sideways when the plane lurched again. A teenage girl curled into a ball, shaking and whispering, "We're going to die," while her mother wrapped her arms around her, trying desperately to provide comfort she didn't feel herself. Another alarm rang in the cockpit, cabin pressure fluctuation. Harris felt a cold wave of terror wash over him. If the pressure dropped too quickly, the plane would enter an uncontrolled emergency descent, and they were already fighting to keep the jet stable. Lane scanned the readings again, sweat forming on his forehead. Pressure is unstable but holding, barely. Harris didn't respond. His entire focus was on the controls. The plane shook so violently it felt like metal grinding against metal. Loose equipment rattled inside the cockpit. The windshield vibrated with each tremor. The pilots felt their stomachs drop as the jet dipped again, losing another 100 feet, then another. Harris tightened his grip. "Come on, stay with me," his voice cracked with strain. Lane tried the engine restart one more time, cycling through the procedure carefully. Nothing. The engine remained dead, the readings unchanged. He slumped slightly, the weight of failure pressing on him. But Harris cut in sharply, "Don't give up. We're not done." Lane straightened, swallowing his fear, and forced himself to focus. Another violent jolt sent both of them against their harnesses. The overhead panels flickered. One of the screens blinked out for a moment before coming back on. Lane felt his heart hammering in his chest. "We can't hold this for long," he said quietly, knowing Harris already understood that grim reality. Outside the cockpit, the sky that had once been calm now looked distorted through the shaking windows. Clouds blurred past them as the plane continued its uneven descent. Passengers clung to each other, bracing for the worst. Every second felt like an eternity, a countdown toward an unknown fate. The roar of the single functioning engine filled the aircraft, vibrating through every seat, every panel, every soul on board. Harris forced himself to remain calm, reminding himself that panic killed more pilots than failures ever did. He focused on the training drilled into him through years of experience. "We stabilize first. We control the descent. We buy time," he muttered. Lane nodded and read off the backup procedures, even though they had both memorized them. Repetition brought a small sense of control in the chaos. The aircraft shook again, but this time something felt different. A subtle shift in balance. A slight easing in the vibrations. Harris noticed it instantly. "Lane, did you feel that?" Lane checked the readings. "Stabilizers are adjusting, maybe the automatic compensation is kicking in." It wasn't enough to solve the problem, but it bought them a few precious seconds, a gift in a situation where seconds meant survival. But then another red light blinked on. Hydraulic. Pressure on the left side was dropping. Harris exhaled sharply, frustration and fear mixing in his chest. "One thing at a time," he whispered, as though trying to convince the plane itself to cooperate. Lane scanned the surrounding radar, hoping for clearer communication or airspace visibility. Instead, he noticed something unexpected. A small blinking indicator on the secondary radar system. At first, he thought it was debris or interference, but then it moved in a controlled pattern. Lane leaned closer. "What is that?" Harris glanced over. "Traffic." Lane shook his head. "No, it's too close, too small, and matching our speed." They watched the small signal hover alongside their position. The computer recognized it a moment later and labeled it, Viper. Their onboard emergency support drone. Activated automatically during catastrophic failures. Lane stared in disbelief. He hadn't even realized the system deployed. The drone now flew beside them, its sensors feeding live data into their failing systems. Lane felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He quickly accessed the Viper interface, watching fresh readings replace their malfunctioning ones. Airflow patterns, altitude pressures, possible glide routes, everything updated in real time. Harris felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "At least we're not alone," he murmured. But they still faced a failing engine, dropping altitude, and a terrified cabin full of passengers. Harris took a deep breath, gripping the controls firmly. "We're fighting this all the way down," he said. Lane nodded, the fear still in his eyes but now mixed with determination and a glimmer of hope. The battle for their lives had only just begun. The plane started dropping fast, and the pilots struggled desperately to restart the engine as the cabin trembled with a violence that none of the passengers had ever experienced before. One moment they had been sipping drinks and watching movies, the next they were being slammed back into their seats as the aircraft tilted downward, the nose dipping with a terrifying inevitability. Every loose item rattled, every overhead light flickered weakly, and every heartbeat inside that jet seemed to sync with the rapid warning beeps screaming from the cockpit. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks deployed with a sudden hiss, dropping from the ceiling like lifelines thrown into a stormy sea. The passengers gasped, faces turning pale as they grabbed the dangling yellow masks with trembling hands. Some struggled to fit them on correctly, fumbling in panic while others cried out, voices cracking with terror. A mother held her baby close, pressing the mask over the child's face before securing her own. A man in his seat prayed softly, words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. A teenager sobbed uncontrollably while clutching the mask to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks and disappearing beneath the plastic. The cabin pressure fluctuated so violently that ears popped, throats tightened, and anxiety spread like wildfire through the narrow aisles. In the cockpit, chaos was unfolding even faster. Captain Harris gripped the controls with such force that his knuckles turned bone white. The plane's rapid descent felt like a physical force trying to tear the yoke out of his hands. He fought to steady the nose, muscles straining under the resistance. Beside him, First Officer Lane flew through the engine restart checklist. Switches flipped, fuel valves cycled, ignition systems rebooted, again and again. Nothing took. The engine remained silent, dead, cold. Alarms blared relentlessly. Red indicators blinked with a merciless rhythm, demanding attention they didn't have the luxury to give. The cockpit vibrated with every shudder of turbulence as the aircraft plunged through layers of unstable air. Papers slid across the console, pens rattled, and the manuals tucked behind their seats shook loose and fell to the floor. Lane tried the emergency restart procedure once more. His hands trembled slightly, not from lack of skill, but from the rising fear that this failure might be permanent. He swallowed hard, voice tight as he said, "No response." "It's not even attempting ignition." Harris didn't look away from the controls. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum trying to break free. "Keep trying. We don't stop." His voice was steady, though inside he felt the terrifying edges of dread creeping in. He'd handled emergencies before, storms, turbulence, technical faults, but a descending aircraft with one engine gone and cabin pressure unstable was a nightmare scenario pilots trained for but hoped to never face. Lane grabbed the radio transmitter again, pressing the button so hard his thumb hurt. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 782, engine failure, uncontrolled descent." His words dissolved into a burst of static. It was like shouting into a void. He tried again, and again. Each attempt returned nothing but broken fragments. Static swallowed his words every time. Harris' jaw tightened. "They can't hear us." Lane's breathing quickened. Interference. Damaged antenna. He shook his head, frustration boiling in his chest. Being unheard in an emergency felt like the universe had stacked the deck against them. Harris kept the plane as stable as he could, though the altitude meter was dropping faster than he wanted to acknowledge. 19,000 feet. 18,500. 18,000. The numbers ticked down like a countdown timer. Behind them, screams echoed faintly through the sealed cockpit door whenever the aircraft lurched. Harris hated that sound most of all. Every voice was a life depending on them. Every cry was a reminder of their responsibility. Lane tried the radio again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Mayday, Flight 782, we are static." Only static. He slammed the transmitter down in frustration. "We're blind and silent. No communication means no vectors, no emergency routing, nothing." Harris didn't respond immediately. His mind raced through options, calculations, contingency plans. A single engine descent was survivable if they could stabilize. But a failing aircraft with a dead engine, loss of pressure, and no radio. The odds were tightening around them like a vice. The plane jolted violently again. A child screamed from the cabin. Someone else shouted. The sound carried through the fuselage, even reaching the cockpit. Lane scanned the panels again. Pressure's still unstable. "If it drops too fast we'll go into an emergency dive." Harris knew that. They both knew that. And they were already in too steep a descent as it was. A new alarm buzzed, sharp and urgent. Lane's eyes darted to the screen. "We're picking up something." He leaned closer, confusion knitting his eyebrows. "What is that?" Harris risked a glance. A small dot blinked on the radar screen, appearing out of nowhere. It wasn't another aircraft. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a bird or drone not registered to aviation channels. This was something else, something with controlled, deliberate movement. The dot matched their speed perfectly. Lane frowned. Doesn't make sense. There shouldn't be anything that close. The radar labeled it automatically after a few seconds, Viper. Lane's confusion melted into shock. Viper. Our backup drone system is active. But we didn't deploy it. Harris' eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope igniting within him. The Viper support drone was a last resort system built for catastrophic failures. It was designed to launch automatically when all critical systems crossed emergency thresholds. The drone could analyze real-time data, calculate glide paths, feed navigation alternatives, and even act as an external observer to guide a crippled aircraft. Is it transmitting data? Harris asked. Lane checked the interface quickly. Fresh readings poured into the console: airflow patterns, altitude pressure, angle of attack corrections, safe descent routes through the surrounding airspace. Their failing instruments flickered and then synchronized with the new data. The drone had linked itself flawlessly, stabilizing the pilot's access to accurate information. Yes, Lane breathed out, relief softening his tense posture. It's feeding data, elevation corrections, thrust compensation models, guidance vectors. He felt something loosen in his chest. Hope. The smallest, faintest spark of hope. For the first time since the engine failed, the cockpit felt less like a death chamber. In the cabin, the passengers still trembled with fear. A man sobbed openly as he clutched his mask. A child cried for her mother who tried to soothe her despite her own shaking hands. A flight attendant moved slowly down the aisle, holding the seats for balance as she reassured people with a strained smile. Everyone could feel the descent. Everyone could sense the danger. But they had no idea that something outside, a silent winged machine, had arrived like a guardian. Harris steadied the controls. The plane still shook, but now he had data he trusted. Not scrambled readings. Not flickering warnings. Solid, externally verified information. Lane opened the Viper display fully, watching in awe as the drone scanned atmospheric pockets, wind tunnels, downdrafts, and air density variations. The system plotted a potential path that could slow their descent. Viper suggests a corrective bank to the right, Lane said. Harris nodded. Let's follow its lead. For the first time in several minutes, he adjusted the yoke with confidence. The aircraft responded, slowly, stubbornly, but it responded. The wing dipped, the path curved, and the nose lifted slightly. The altitude meter slowed its rapid decline. Not stopped, but slowed. You're doing it, Lane breathed out. No, Harris said quietly. We're doing it. Us, and the drone. The entire cockpit filled with a silent tension. The noise of the alarms, the roar of the engine, the hum of the failing systems, it all faded behind the realization that they weren't alone in this fight. The Viper drone, small but powerful, flew beside them like a guardian angel in the sky. Its sensors gleamed in the sunlight as it mirrored their path, matching every dip and tilt precisely. Lane felt a surge of emotion, relief, fear, gratitude, rush through him. He wiped sweat from his forehead and steadied his breathing. We might actually make it through this. Harris didn't allow himself the comfort of believing that fully yet. Not until they regained stable altitude. Not until they had a plan for landing. Not until every passenger was safely back on solid ground. But for the first time since the failure, he felt the fear in his chest loosen its grip. The Viper drone pulsed another update into their system. An adjusted descent rate, a safer glide path, and a new set of corrective maneuvers to keep the aircraft stable. Lane monitored everything closely, hands ready over the switches. Harris flew with a renewed determination. Beyond the windshield, the sky still stretched endlessly, clouds swirling around them as they descended. But now, a small metallic figure accompanied them through the chaos. Viper, the autonomous aviation drone designed for crisis support, locked onto the aircraft's signal with precise efficiency. A metallic glint cut through the sky as it aligned itself with the falling jet, its compact frame slicing through turbulent winds that shook the larger aircraft violently. The drone's stabilizers adjusted constantly, tiny fins twitching as it compensated for the jet's erratic descent. Inside the cockpit, fresh data began pouring into the screens as Viper synchronized with the jet's failing systems. Real-time wind direction updates flashed across the panels. Altitude pressure readings corrected themselves. Glide path recommendations formed in glowing lines, updating every second as the situation changed. For a moment, both pilots stared at the incoming data almost in disbelief. It felt surreal that this small machine, no bigger than a motorcycle, was now acting as their virtual co-pilot, their extra pair of eyes in the sky, their last lifeline in a situation spiraling beyond their control. Lane leaned closer to the radar, watching Viper's icon pulse as it transmitted data with machine-like precision. The drone's engines hummed just outside the cockpit windows, barely visible in the chaos of wind and shaking metal. He felt a surge of hope, sharp and sudden, rush through his chest. "It's guiding us," he cried, unable to contain the relief in his voice. Harris didn't need to hear it twice. His eyes narrowed with renewed determination. Sweat rolled down his face, the strain of fighting the controls taking every ounce of strength he had left. But now, with a stable stream of information, he had something he could trust. Something that wasn't flickering or failing. Something that wasn't distorted by the aircraft's internal damage. Lane's voice rang out over the deafening roar of the single operating engine. "Follow Viper." Harris banked the aircraft carefully, following the glowing guidance line that appeared across the navigation screen as Viper mapped out a trajectory. The jet tilted right sharply at first, the sudden movement eliciting another wave of terrified screams from the cabin. Loose items clattered against the floor. Overhead compartments shook. A child cried out for her mother, and someone shouted a prayer toward the ceiling as if begging the sky for mercy. Inside the cockpit, both pilots felt the plane shudder violently as it fought against the wind shear. The right wing dipped, and Harris corrected it, his muscles aching from the constant battle. The drone's guidance instructions updated rapidly, suggesting subtle angle adjustments and altitude corrections. Lane called them out in quick bursts, his voice tense but clear. 2 degrees right. Maintain thrust at current level. Adjust pitch -3. Harris followed each instruction with mechanical precision, though sweat dripped down his temples and his hands trembled slightly with the weight of responsibility. The altitude meter continued its downward spiral. 16,000 feet. 15,800. 15,500. Every number carved itself into their nerves. Lane stared ahead through the cockpit glass. Far in the distance, between jagged outlines of rising terrain, lay a narrow valley. It was almost hidden by mist and shifting clouds. Without Viper's guidance, they never would have noticed it in time. The valley stretched out like a slim corridor between towering ridges, offering a potential path sheltered from turbulent air currents. It could help stabilize their descent, buying them time to regain control, or at least prevent a catastrophic crash. "That's our shot," Lane said, voice steady despite the fear pulsing beneath it. "If we can get into that valley, the mountains will block the worst of the crosswinds." Harris gritted his teeth as the aircraft shook again. "Then we get there." The drone remained right outside their window, keeping perfect pace with the failing jet. Its sensors flickered in rapid bursts as it adjusted its position, each movement controlled and deliberate. At times, it dipped slightly below the jet, scanning air pressure variations under the fuselage. Other times it soared slightly above, mapping disturbances caused by unstable airflow patterns. Everything it learned, it transmitted instantly into the cockpit. In the cabin, passengers held onto their masks and each other with trembling hands. The scent of fear hung thick in the air, sweat, panic, the metallic tang of oxygen. A man gripped his seat so tightly that his knuckles turned ghost white. A woman clutched her husband's arm, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Please, please let us live." Flight attendants moved as best they could, their own fear masked behind forced, tight smiles. One knelt beside an elderly passenger who clutched her chest, trying to reassure her even as the plane lurched again. But none of the passengers could see the small drone outside guiding them. None of them could see the miracle that had arrived to help them through the storm. Lane glanced at the drone's feed. "Viper is recommending a gradual descent along the valley's left side," he said. He zoomed the display, eyebrows rising as he read the turbulence projections. "If we angle too far right, we'll hit a downdraft that'll drop us by 1,000 feet in seconds." "Left side it is," Harris said. He turned the yoke carefully. The aircraft groaned in response, metal straining as the jet eased toward the valley path. Outside, the mountains grew larger, their rocky faces etched with ridges and sharp angles. Clouds drifted lazily against the peaks, hiding slopes and cliffs beneath veils of silver. The closer they got, the more dangerous the environment became. One wrong turn, one gust of wind, one miscalculated angle, and they would slam into the mountainside. Lane called out updates from the drone. Wind shift coming in 3 seconds. Prepare for turbulence. Harris braced himself moments before the aircraft jolted violently to the left, a blast of air slamming against the fuselage. The nose dipped, and he fought it, pulling up hard. The drone anticipated the shift, adjusting its position in the air as if dancing on invisible threads. It projected a corrective maneuver that flashed across their screen. Harris followed it without hesitation. The jet steadied, shaking, trembling, but holding course. 14,000 feet. 13,800. 13,000. Lane kept scanning the data. Pressure pockets ahead. Viper suggests dropping another 100 feet to avoid the worst turbulence. We don't have much altitude to spare, Harris warned. If we don't, we risk rolling the aircraft. Harris made the adjustment. The plane dipped, and passengers screamed as gravity pressed them into their seats. Bags tumbled from open compartments. Someone shouted that they couldn't breathe. The floor rattled beneath unsteady feet. But the downward adjustment guided them into a smoother air pocket, and the shaking decreased. Not gone, just less violent. Lane looked ahead, hopeful. We're entering the valley. The world outside the cockpit transformed. Towering cliffs rose on either side, close enough that Harris felt as if he could reach out and touch them. Shadows draped across the valley floor as sunlight filtered through broken clouds. Trees dotted the slopes in thick patches, their tops swaying in strong winds. The natural corridor channeled air currents that swirled unpredictably, yet offered a shelter from the far stronger turbulence. Above, Viper darted ahead, scanning every pocket of unstable air. Data updated so quickly on the screen that Lane felt his eyes struggle to keep up. Follow its trajectory exactly, he said. Harris responded instantly, guiding the jet along the narrow path. The valley twisted gently, and he adjusted for each curve. Sweat dripped down his arms as he fought the controls with unwavering focus. His shoulders ached, his fingers hurt, but he did not let go. He did not falter. The drone calculated a new glide slope and displayed a recommended pitch angle. Harris followed it. The jet trembled but obeyed. The mountains rose sharply, their rocky faces like jagged teeth lining a giant mouth waiting to swallow them if they strayed off course by even a fraction. Lane felt his breath hitch as he watched their altitude tick downward. 12,000 feet. 11,800. His voice was tight, fragile, as if afraid the wrong inflection might shatter the thin thread of success they were clinging to. Outside, the drone's engines pulsed, keeping it perfectly aligned with the jet. Its small frame zipped through the air with fierce determination. Sparks of sunlight glinted off its metallic exterior. A machine with no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. A machine built for this moment. Harris kept flying, his mind laser-focused. Every muscle in his body worked in harmony, every instinct fired at full alert. Lane monitored Viper's stream of data like it was holy scripture guiding them through a maze of death. The valley narrowed slightly. Harris tightened his grip. Lane held his breath. Viper sent an urgent correction, a sharp right adjustment. Harris turned the yoke. The jet leaned. And it fit, barely, through the narrowing space. Behind the cockpit door, the passengers felt the sudden turn. Cries broke out. Someone vomited. A flight attendant stumbled and caught herself just in time. But the jet passed the narrowing without scraping the ridges. Lane exhaled shakily. We made it through the pinch point. Harris didn't respond. He couldn't afford distraction. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, where the valley widened again into a sweeping bend that glowed faintly under a break in the clouds. The drone surged forward, scanning every inch of the route. Viper projected a new glide path, one that would carry them safely through the valley's next section. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was survivable. Lane stared at the glowing line on the screen, then looked at Harris. We can do this, he said softly. Harris nodded, determination burning in his eyes. And with the little drone flying beside them like a silent guardian, they pressed forward toward the only chance of survival the sky had left to offer. The plane continued to shake violently as it plummeted through layers of turbulent air, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity for the passengers and crew. Oxygen masks dangled and swung wildly above the terrified faces of those strapped into their seats, while overhead bins rattled and trembled as though they might burst open at any moment. Captain Harris kept a tight grip on the control column, his knuckles white from the pressure, and Lane's eyes were glued to the gauges that flickered with warnings and fluctuating readings. Yet through the chaos, one thing remained constant: the steady guidance of Viper flying just outside their shattered world, holding position with a precision that seemed almost impossible given the storm of disaster swirling around them. Viper transmitted a steady stream of telemetry, each data packet synchronized with the aircraft's failing onboard systems, giving the crew a sense of direction where otherwise there would have been none. Its glowing sensors swept the surrounding skies, calculating not just the plane's velocity, but the minute-by-minute changes in wind shear and drag affecting their descent. Harris scanned the display, watching as Viper projected a thin line representing their best possible glide path. Every instinct he had told him the aircraft was too damaged, that one wrong move could send them spinning into an unrecoverable dive. But the drone's calculations were frighteningly accurate, painting a picture of a narrow survival corridor threading through clouds, mountains, and unpredictable air pressure. Lane tapped the override switch, stabilizing the remaining engine. It sputtered, coughed, and shook so violently that the entire cockpit vibrated, but it held. Barely. Just enough to give them a fighting chance. Below them, the world was still a blur of grays and whites, clouds swirling like smoke around the windows that had begun to fog with condensation. The passengers were silent now, not because the danger had passed, but because terror had stolen their voices. A child clung to her mother's arm so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. An elderly man whispered prayers under his breath. Others stared blankly forward, unable to comprehend how quickly fate had turned against them. At 3,000 feet, the alarms screamed again, another stall warning, another drop in airspeed, another shudder in the failing structure. Lane swallowed hard and tried the engine restart sequence again. The turbine whined, shook, and then, miraculously, ignited with a weak but steady roar. It wasn't full power, not even close, but it was enough to slow their rate of descent. Enough to buy them seconds that could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Viper instantly recalibrated the new trajectory and shifted position, banking left and flashing a signal for the pilots to follow. Harris adjusted the flaps, feeling the aircraft respond in small but significant ways. The jet no longer felt like a falling brick, it felt like something they could control, something they could work with. The valley Viper had guided them toward began to open below them, jagged cliffs rising on either side like the jaws of a predator ready to snap shut. But through the center of that valley ran a corridor of relatively calm air. Narrow, unforgiving, but real. The first glimpse of the runway came like a miracle. Lane exhaled shakily, the tension in his chest easing as the clouds parted just enough for them to see the strip of asphalt waiting in the distance. It was far too short for a comfortable emergency landing, especially in their condition, but at that moment it felt like salvation carved onto the earth. Viper flew slightly ahead, shifting altitude to show the optimal descent angle. Its sensors blinked steadily, a beacon of logic and precision against the emotional chaos inside the plane. Harris lowered the landing gear. The impact of the wind against the damaged systems made the wheels shudder violently, but they locked into place. The aircraft dropped lower, the mountains towering dangerously close. Lane made micro-adjustments to the throttle, keeping the weak engine alive long enough for the final approach. Every bump of turbulence sent another ripple of fear through the passengers. Some gripped their armrests as though holding on might somehow keep the plane in the air. Others wept quietly. One woman mouthed silent goodbye messages to the loved ones she feared she would never see again. The ground rushed up fast, too fast. Harris pulled back gently on the yoke, feeling the resistance of the damaged control surfaces. He had landed planes thousands of times, in simulations, in real emergencies, in unexpected weather conditions, but never with a drone acting as their guiding star. Viper's final vector flashed across Lane's display, a precise alignment with the center of the runway, allowing no room for error. Harris followed the line as though his life depended on it, because it did. The jet slammed onto the runway with a force that rattled every bolt and joint in the frame. Sparks burst from beneath the plane as the damaged landing gear absorbed the brutal impact. The tires screeched, smoke rising in thick curls around them. Harris applied the brakes carefully, aware that too much pressure could cause the weakened structure to collapse. The aircraft skidded, veering slightly left before Lane countered with the rudder. The sensation of sliding across the runway felt endless, a nightmare that stretched into slow motion. Finally, the plane shuddered to a stop. Silence settled like a blanket over the cabin. A deep, profound silence that lasted several seconds before sound returned in the form of gasps, sobs, and cries of overwhelming relief. People unbuckled their seatbelts with trembling hands. Some collapsed forward, heads in their palms, unable to process what had just happened. Others stood slowly, touching the walls, the seats, anything solid to remind themselves they were alive. Harris exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Lane leaned back in his seat, his entire body shaking from adrenaline. They exchanged a glance, no words, just raw emotion. Outside, Viper hovered for a moment as though making sure the job was truly done. Its lights blinked softly, almost like a farewell gesture, before it ascended quietly into the sky, fading into the clouds that had nearly claimed them. The passengers would later say that Viper appeared like a guardian angel, a silent force that guided them when hope was nearly gone. Others would call it a miracle of technology. But for those on board, it wasn't about labels. It was about survival. It was about witnessing something extraordinary in a moment of unimaginable fear. Emergency vehicles raced toward the aircraft, lights flashing across the rain-slick runway. Paramedics climbed aboard, checking passengers one by one. Many were crying, some laughing hysterically, others unable to speak. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, asking if the little flying robot would come back to say goodbye. The mother wiped tears from her cheeks and hugged her daughter tightly, grateful beyond words that she still had the chance to answer her child's questions. Harris finally stood, steadying himself against the cockpit doorframe. He watched as fire crew inspected the smoking landing gear and engineers rushed to evaluate the damage. Only then did he truly understand just how close they had come to disaster. The aircraft's left engine was barely attached, hanging at an angle that made clear how catastrophic another few seconds of delay could have been. The fuselage was scorched from friction. Several panels were warped from turbulence forces that exceeded safe limits. Lane ran his hand across the console, silently thanking the machine that had held together just long enough. His mind kept drifting back to the ironclad voice of the alarms, the fear in the passengers' screams, and the faint but steady pulse of Viper's transmissions. It had cut through all the chaos like a lifeline. When the passengers finally disembarked, many reached out to thank the pilots, their gratitude overwhelming. Some hugged them, others simply pressed a trembling hand over their hearts. Harris accepted each gesture quietly, knowing that although skill had guided his hands, it was Viper's data that had given them a path. Lane felt the same, humbled by the strange partnership formed in the sky between human instinct and machine precision. In the days that followed, news outlets worldwide would broadcast the story. Headlines would praise the bravery of the pilots and the incredible capabilities of Viper, the drone that saved an aircraft in freefall. Analysts would debate whether this marked a turning point in aviation safety. People everywhere would watch the footage with awe, their hearts racing as they imagined the terror inside the falling plane and the miraculous landing that followed. But for those who lived it, the truth was simpler. They had survived. Against all odds, they had touched down on solid ground. And in their memories, the image of Viper flying beside them through clouds and chaos would remain forever, a symbol of hope in a moment when hope felt impossible.